Cormac McCarthy fans, we are here today to talk about Edgar Allan Poe and Cormac McCarthy. And even though Poe is considered American Gothic and McCarthy is considered Southern Gothic, they are Gothic authors nonetheless, especially McCarthy's first four novels. And so when we are looking at the start of McCarthy's writing career, he leaves the while in the Air Force, he starts to read a bunch. And then after a couple years of university, he was ready to become a professional writer. He submits The Orchard Keeper and thus starts his writing career. But I think during that initial awakening, he had said previously he really never read very intensely before that he had to read kind of the canonical and classical authors before he could get to the next level. That's probably like a lot of you guys. You read at the start of your reading career, and it's supposed to happen in middle school and high school, all the classics, all the easy books. And then eventually you start branching off into some of the meta stuff. But around the time of the composition of The Orchard Keeper, McCarthy was pretty into Edgar Allan Poe. And I'm seeing this is that McCarthy, I'm sure, read Edgar Allan Poe in high school and during his reading awakening time. But McCarthy left San Francisco. McCarthy was spending time in San Francisco. He could have, kept living there or gone to New York City or the Iowa Writers Workshop, wherever he saw best. But instead, he returned to the South and he became the next lineage holder of the Southern Gothic style after Faulkner died in the early 1960s and Flannery O'Connor died at the very same period in the very same time as well. And so while McCarthy was writing The Orchard Keeper, he had actually tried for years since he had returned from the Air Force, if not while in the Air Force, to write this story about this self-conscious artist. It was actually very Proustian at its core, but as we've seen with McCarthy and I've talked about before, he's not very Proustian, even though he, I think, wants that style. It's just not how he works best. So this story, aka Suttree, takes almost 20 years to write, and it starts off with a self-conscious man who calls himself a poet, and the draft is very lyrical. And I've checked out some of the earlier drafts of Suttree and Blood Meridian, and let me just say they weren't very good. I mean, I got a comment the other day. Someone was saying Faulkner wrote "As I Lay Dying" in 42 days while working at sawmill or wherever the hell he was, and spending a couple years on a piece is like a really long time. But if we got the early drafts of Suttree or Blood Meridian, like if that's what was released, we wouldn't be talking about Cormac McCarthy right now. They were really bad, and Cormac isn't above having to edit. He's not some talented writer who in the first, second, or third draft, some of these were going for 10 plus drafts. He doesn't really catch the feeling of a book for a long time. Because I'll have to talk about this in another video and kind of give you guys the analysis. But in Blood Meridian, it was like a Western. It was like almost a historical Western without any of the hardcore violence. There was a little bit of violence, but there wasn't like the judge and all this existential dread and the weird omniscient dialogue happening. A lot of that wasn't present for a while. And you guys would laugh because McCarthy at times would write about Suttree or the judge, and it would be like you were reading a John Green novel. But I think this was McCarthy just relaxing and like knowing he had time and like just letting his creative process like let itself out and just like working on multiple drafts without like too much like mind of what was going on. And just because there are like ideas that like you could sit and plot your novel out, right? I could spend a couple months plotting out all this different stuff, or I could write a draft, and it's almost the same thing. I just plotted the whole novel, and it probably takes the same amount of time, if not less time, and you're practicing writing. And then for the next draft, you could plot it out and figure out where it's going, or just almost rewrite every scene and repiece it back together. And that process could just keep going on until you're finally ready to make, the more minute changes. And from from what I can tell, the authors that do redrafts instead of replotting and like trying to figure all that out too early end up doing way better. They might take more years to publish the novel, but it's a more effective process because you're basically letting the unconscious solve what needs to happen. And the first reference we have to Edgar Allan Poe in the very early draft for Suttree is Edgar Allan Poe Ulalume, where a character is basically going toward the tomb of an old lover, and it's got like a very gothic-y like feel to it. But McCarthy, right next to this passage that he writes, gives a very similar story. He makes a dream sequence, which we're about to read, where these characters are walking through a honeysuckle jungle to a cemetery, and it's like kind of dark and weird. And so we're about to read this piece from an early draft of Suttree, and it's somewhat goofy. Quote, he knows his own dark lake that lies in a silence where the wind's forbidding fingers are not even heard, and deep and cold these waters in the cave she covers where Grendel lurks. And there's also a lake in Ulalume by Edgar Allan Poe. And so this is also really funny. I'm going to have to go on this tangent another time, but there's a Beowulf reference here, which McCarthy seems to love Beowulf, which is kind of like a proto-Gothic, proto-McCarthyan in the sense that it was the greatest American epic with like nature in it. Beowulf is the only text we have in English that has some of the pagan elements in it that mimicked nature back in the day, like over 1,000 years ago. A lot of the time, writing, especially pagan writing, mimicked the forms of the forms of the story, mimicked aspects of nature, elements of nature. And Beowulf has a little of that, actually a fair amount of that in there. And eventually the Christian church and the Dark Ages and all that got, pushed in the Enlightenment period, pushed all that away. And we've really never been able to recover that. But people like McCarthy and a lot of, nature poets have tried to return to that. And so even though this line doesn't end up making the cut, something that did make the cut that was around a similar time is in The Orchard Keeper. And I actually didn't catch this. That's what's so great. I can make a 10-hour Orchard Keeper course and The Orchard Keeper, and I miss things. So in Edgar Allan Poe's The Black Cat, there is a black cat who is black but also has a white spot. So then transport, into ourselves in The Orchard Keeper, we have Arthur Ownby, who's in his 90s, and he's going a little bit crazy. And when he was young, he got the ability from this ex-slave shamaness to be able to see werecats and connect with nature and see these kind of ley lines and feelings out in nature. But eventually he hurts nature and he goes through these things. So later in his life, he's feeling the weight of his past karmic actions. So cats are like harassing him and in one scene with the cat, it goes, quote, from McCarthy, black in the parlor square of the window, a white mark on its face like an inverted gull wing. And the window frame went all black and the room was filling up, the white mark looming and growing. And this is a direct rip from Edgar Allan Poe because in The Black Cat, basically the very same thing happens. Because at the start of the story, it starts off very small. There's this white mark that's not even there. But by the end of the story, the white mark is growing. So McCarthy uses a great tactic from Edgar Allan Poe in the middle of the story. And this is what it's about, everyone. We could call that stealing, but I don't care. Does that matter? No, because it's one little thing in a large story that is unique, trying to put emphasis on a scene. If you were moved by something, then it should be a compliment if you want to use that again in the future. It's not that you're lesser than, it's that you are standing on the shoulders of giants because that's how you become great. And that's why modern literature at some level is not very good because a lot of authors are not reading. They are not building up. I remember I heard an interview with I can't remember this guy's name, but he's one of the most famous authors right now. And he says that he never has read anything, doesn't like reading, and he only writes a couple hours a month. And basically just finishes a first draft a year, turns it in, and is is beloved by TikTok. And the reason that he is trash, and if we look at everyone else, I'm like, hey, what have you done? What are you studying? They're not studying anything. But if you look at the guys all on this shelf, they were all studying a ton of people. If you look at Dune is just filled with influences. Frank Herbert was so inspired by other authors that he puts them, sometimes quotes of them at the start of every single chapter. And there's thousands of chapters in Dune. All right, so if you guys know anything that is connected to Poe that I missed, let me know. Comment down below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.